Hi everyone, it's GigaBeef here, and today we're going to be learning some lessons from the world of poker and how they cross over into Escape from Tarkov. So stick around and let's get going. Card games and Tarkov are clearly very different, but there are enough similarities, especially around mindset and strategy, that we can learn from by investigating and comparing the two. We're going to have to explain some basics and concepts, so bear with me as I want this to be just as accessible for those of you who have never played poker before as to those who are very familiar with the game. So what is poker anyway? There are lots of different types, but we're going to be referring to the most popular version of the game, Texas Hold'em, mostly because it's the one that I'm familiar with. Most people who don't know the game when they think of poker think of tournaments like the World Series, at casinos or online. However, when I used to play routinely back in the day, I preferred to play a version referred to as cash games. These are where you sit down at the table, metaphorically speaking if you play online, set down your buy-in, which conventionally is 100 times the size of the minimum bet, and play. Given you can leave anytime you want, this is highly appealing to some players who don't want to sit there through what can be hours of tournament action. When the game begins and the round starts, enforced bets called blinds get played. Everyone gets 2 cards in their hand, and there's a round of betting, and then 3 cards are placed on the table. Another round of betting occurs, then the 4th card is placed on the table, and another round of betting happens. The 5th and final card is placed on the table, and a final round of betting occurs, which one way or another usually results in one player who wins all the money that was bet so far in that hand. Why is this game anything like EFT? Well, there are a few key concepts that are shared between poker and Tarkov, but also apply to many other games too. Today we're going to focus on incomplete information, economic management, the dislocation of decision making and success, the fear of loss, and finally, the concept of leveling. Let's start with incomplete information. What this means is when beginning a round of poker, you know what cards that you have, how many players you're against, and the relative sizes of the cash amounts that they have on the table to play with, and potentially some history on their likely actions, depending on how long you've been playing with a certain subset of opponents. What we don't know is what cards they have. We do know, however, what the possible range of cards are, as they can hold any combinations of 2 cards in the deck, bar the cards that you're holding yourself. As the game progresses, the actions of the other players give away information about what they could potentially hold in their own hand, and fundamentally the game of poker is not really about fancy things like bluffing and going all in like you see in the movies, and much more about working out the range of cards that your opponents could be holding with which they would play their hand in the way that they have done. If you can figure that out, then bluffing and other cool strategies will work out a lot better. When we start a round of Tarkov, we know our loadout, starting location and squad size, and it's public knowledge to know the spawns for that map as well at the moment. But we know nothing about who our opponents are, what gear they might be looking to use, or what their objective is. This makes Tarkov similarly probabilistic in this way. When choosing a route, we have to think through the possible ways that enemies might be taking through the map, and their various probabilities of encounters and with what types of player, to various target locations for loot, quests or PvP. When building our loadouts, we need to keep in mind what the range of opposition gear, weapons and rounds we might be facing in the context of the progress of the wipe is, which also depends on where we might be going on the map specifically. A loadout for dorms is likely going to look different to a generic customs loadout, where you could be fighting at distance too, and there's no point bringing high pen rounds near the start of the wipe because no one's running high tier armour. For example, right now towards the late middle or early end of patch 12.11, I think it's worth using level 5 armour because of the plethora of rounds that you'll prevent yourself from dying to than if you were using class 4, and in terms of rounds to be using at least 545 BT or M856A1 with 37 pen to have a chance of killing other players in general. Between 2 opponents of equal skill and positioning, you just need your kit to be that little bit better to get an edge over the average PMC, without spending so much that getting killed by someone more experienced or in a better position takes you out of a huge chunk of your stash value. This brings us neatly onto the next topic of economic management. Both poker and Tarkov are games of economics, where often the measure of success is measured in money. This is not always strictly true in EFT, but if money is no longer an issue for you, then you're playing in the endgame anyway. In poker cash games, there is a rule of thumb that for the game you're playing in, you should have 20 times the buy-in as your overall account value as a minimum, i.e. if you're playing a game where the blinds or the enforced bets are around 1 cent and 2 cent, where the minimum bet is 2 cents, then a buy-in is 100 times that at $2 like we said earlier, and your overall account value should be at least 20 times that or $40. This is because even when making good decisions, you can easily end up out of pocket due to chance, and you need to have the funds ready to survive through a series of unfortunate outcomes. This is the same with Tarkov loadouts. You can easily die multiple times in a row, and whether it's your fault through being too aggressive, out of position, missing shots, or looting uncleared bodies, it can also happen that they get a miracle pen and fragment on a round that is unlikely to go through your armor in the first place, or someone just happens to be in an unlikely spot and kills you without ever being visible. This is common sense to most people, but it's the reason you should play very frugally at the beginning of your Tarkov career and min-max your loadouts, and don't run 500k kits when you only have 1 mil in the bank if you care about not going broke. However, as you get more confident and your survival rate grows and you learn to make more money in the game, you can improve the value and quality of your kits with your bank balance. We don't need to be as strict with our buffer as in poker, partly because the looting in Tarkov makes it not a zero-sum game in the first place, but you should feel comfortable doing raids with 20 times your kit value in stash in my opinion. This would mean that if you're taking in a 300k kit to raid as standard, you would be looking to have around 6 million rubles spare, and that would leave you very unlikely to go broke anytime soon. And honestly, I think that 10 times would work fine for most people. We mentioned deaths that are not your fault, and this brings us on to the next topic, the dislocation of success and correct decision making. Poker and other games of chance have an interesting game loop that defies the usual logic of human minds when playing games and getting better. Usually when you do something and you make the wrong decision or fail in some way, you can see what happened and try to either prevent it next time or learn from your mistake. Winning generally means you did things right, and losing means you did things wrong, which is fine because in failure we can learn how to do things better next time, and this is why people say you learn more from failure than from success. Where this gets interesting is in a game like poker, you can do everything right and still lose. An easy example is having a pair of aces in your hand right off the bat before any cards have been played onto the table and going all in against someone right away. You have an overwhelming advantage against every other hand, so the situation is a no-brainer. However, sometimes when the cards fall, you lose anyway. This also happens the other way around when you play badly but end up winning due to chance. In these various situations, this is when you hear classics such as "every time I get a good hand I get so unlucky," because people in general are much more likely to remember these situations than the ones that lived up to expectation. The right approach here is to look at how the situation played out, and if given the information that you had at the time you wouldn't have played it any differently, then it's a job well done. Unfortunately, there are many more nuanced situations where it's just not as clear cut, where you can still do everything right and lose anyway. For those scenarios, it can be hard to know if you did the right thing or not without going back and analysing those situations in detail, trying to precisely pinpoint the possibilities and deciding that in a situation perhaps you had a 55% chance of success and that's fine in the long run, or instead maybe 45%, which you can then learn from for the future. The key is being unbiased and realistic in your analysis. I'm sure we've all felt parallels in Tarkov. With the armor pen system, as I alluded to earlier, you can die to random chance on penetration and fragments against rounds that shouldn't really defeat your armor, but also, as with many FPS games, you can lose to a random headshot on the first bullet as someone comes around the corner, or even things like weapons malfunctions now that they've been added. We have to be very careful with our conclusions that a certain route is always camped and that certain rounds don't work, because our experience is a small snapshot of the whole and typically not a good sample size to make a fully informed choice without proper investigation. In the poker world, people say, scared money doesn't make money. We spoke previously about the necessity of a buy-in buffer to stop you from playing outside of your financial comfort zone, and part of what this is for is to allow you to stop worrying about the money itself and concentrate on the game. Obviously, the overall goal in poker is to end up with more money than you started with, but fixating on that during the game often leads to poor decision making and interestingly tends to hurt your overall performance. This is highly analogous in Tarkov, and I have seen numerous times people saying things like, "Why do I do so much better on my scav than with my geared PMC?" There are some various reasons why this is the case, but a large part is down to what we refer to as gear fear, which is the same thing as scared money, focusing on or not being able to stop thinking about not wanting to lose a kit rather than playing optimally against your opponents. Sometimes the best play in both games is aggression, and without it you can be run over, but playing with fear can force you into inaction instead and resulting in you losing more often. Once you've picked a loadout that you believe is optimal, then you simply have to play to the best of your ability whilst putting the kit cost to the back of your mind. This doesn't mean to forget it completely, as there are situations where you may not want to go for a kill with a geared loadout when you get a choice whether to engage or not. For example, fighting a naked dude running an SVD when you're all geared up, as the risk reward just isn't there. But if you get forced into a fight, your decisions need to be freed up of any external fear to perform at your best in the here and now. As a scav, most people feel like they aren't risking anything, so can play free of any mental overlay that causes them to develop this kind of performance anxiety. The final topic I want to discuss today is a concept called leveling. In poker, there are various different stages of mindset that you go through when learning to play. Level 0 being you know the basic rules of the game, and that's about it. A level 0 player has no real idea about the relative strengths of different cards and just plays, and then likely loses, equivalent to a brand new player in Tarkov. Level 1 is where you're aware of your own cards and their relative strength with the cards on the table, e.g. I have a pair of kings, this is a good hand. This is the equivalent to a Tarkov player who knows how to use the ballistics table and pick some rounds that seem decent when going into their raids. Level 2 is what we were discussing earlier, where you're aware of your own cards in the context of your opponent's cards, attempting to work out the potential ranges of cards that other players may hold based on their actions and how that relates to the strength of your own holding. This in turn will lead you to attempt to extract maximum value out of a hand that you deem likely superior to your opponent's range in general, or attempt to get to the end result cheaply enough with a hand that you deem poorer than your opponent's. This is really where the game of poker begins if you're playing seriously, and in Tarkov is equivalent to good players that understand their loadouts in the context of the wipe in general and know the common paths to exploit the likely movement of others. This is even the same for things like CQB, such as what angles might my opponent be holding and when should I pre-fire. Level 3 is when you consider this one step further. What does my opponent think that I have? If you can genuinely think on this level, then you are considered a very good player. Being aware of the signals that you yourself put out and how they are perceived by your opponents is not easy, and formally is where bluffing comes in, because bluffing actually works better against good players, as they are likely to have assigned a card range to you in the first place. But interestingly, there is an implicit assumption here that your opponents are thinking on the second level for this to work properly. Out-leveling yourself, as it's called, is when you are beaten by a player thinking on level 0 or 1 by playing optimally versus level 2 thinking. If your opponent isn't even thinking on that basis, you can easily lose to stupid stuff. A Tarkov analogy that has happened to me a few times a wipe or two ago is playing in a duo. Your partner gets killed, but you now know that your enemy knows that you'll be watching the body, so you move into a position to defend against flanks, preparing for the incoming rotation, but by the time you get there, lo and behold, your buddy's body was looted already and your opponent is nowhere to be seen. This is a classic leveling issue, assuming that your opponent is thinking as you would with there's always one more and clear the area before looting, etc, but instead they went straight in for it unprotected and ended up winning because you were 3 steps ahead of yourself. Years ago, I used to play a lot of StarCraft 2, and there was a particularly notorious player who lost a match and said to his opponent, "You only won because you're so bad," i.e. his adversary used a build that no one usually used because it's not good, but because of that, it took his supposedly good strategy by surprise because it was not designed to defend against it. This is a case where, if valid, the better player should be able to step down their level as required, especially against opponents that they know or have a history with, in order to use more effective strategies against them. Unfortunately, in EFT, we never really build up a history of our opponents like you do in poker, games like Rust, and also potentially strategy games too. So other than making some assumptions based on what you can see about enemy players and what they're wearing, which locations they've decided to go to, i.e. where you've gone, and also how they approach the initial engagement, it's sometimes hard to get a feel for this too specifically. Perhaps we will see more of this kind of action with Streets and Open World, but that remains to be seen. If you enjoyed today's video and you want to support the channel, please consider dropping a like, sub or a comment, all are free to do and help out a lot. Also, don't forget to check out the channel's new dedicated music playlists on Spotify, the links for which are in the description. To see when I'm streaming, you can join the Discord and follow me on Twitter. I'm usually live twice a week on Twitch, and once on Friday at 9 PM UK time for the ScavTalk podcast with my fellow Tarkov at church, which is in the description too, and a regular Tarkov stream on Saturday at 2 PM UK time. And with all that said, I'll see you next time, and as always, have fun in your raids.